Work session items. We have discussion of sidewalk ordinance, sidewalk program, a discussion on city council policy CP3 for sale of city-owned property, a discussion on a recycling center, and a discussion on water and sewer rates. So we will begin with public comments on work session related items. Public comment are limited to 5 minutes. Anyone wishing to make a public comment needs to step forward to the podium, state their name and address. Are there any public comments?
Bob Grabowski on 4th Street. I didn't see your video yet on the sidewalk program, but for one thing, the sidewalk belongs to the city. Now I suppose they're gonna tell us that we have to pay for new sidewalks when they need it. And who carries the liability on it? I'll tell you who crushes the sidewalk is that snow machine. Get the people out there and let them shovel their own sidewalks, like I have to do, or the other old ladies up the street shovel the sidewalks. But the people are too lazy to get out there. They send a snow machine there, probably about 6,000 pounds, bounding on that sidewalk, and then when they crack it or put her on an angle, then they're going to charge the people to replace the sidewalk or to straighten it. And another thing, I don't know what their policy is on these sidewalks, but years ago when they started at replacing them, they had three of the sections. One was cracked and the other two were leaning. They went through from one street to all the way up the block to the next street. They blew all the money away and they only did about four blocks. I don't know what the policy is now, but if I was in the city, I'd get a hydraulic lift on that front end loader, put some armed clamps on there, lift that block up, dig around that root, cut it out, and backfill it, and put the thing back down. You wouldn't have to replace all the sidewalks for a block. All it takes is a little more time. And then I'm strictly against water and sewer rates. They got $25 million. They ought to find out how many people are unemployed and how many elderly people on fixed income. The water rates keep going up. 25 million are dropping a bucket to everybody, I guess. They probably got $11 million more than what they needed to replace that at 5th and Ramsell Street. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other public comments on agenda-related items? If not, we'll move on to the first item, discussion on the sidewalk ordinance and the sidewalk program. Mr. McCullough.
Good evening. There's been a lot of discussion about sidewalks. A lot of requests have been coming to you from residents individually, so we thought this was a good time to talk about how the sidewalk program has operated in the past and how it's currently operating, and then I'll go through some highlights of what the current ordinance says. So my understanding is past practice, this was 5 years and prior, residents would call into the Public Works office, they would make a complaint about a sidewalk heaved, broken, whatever. The Public Works kept a list of those sidewalks, and then on an annual basis, those requests were reviewed and a project was put together, and for the most part the project was contracted out where whoever was hired would come in and do the removals and then and do the replacements, and those were all lists that were created, or the project areas were created by the Public Works office. The budget, to my knowledge, has been over $20,000 a year for sidewalk replacement for at least a decade and probably longer than that. What we've done, or have been doing the past 3-4 years, is we've created a 3-tiered system. We took a look at this program along with a lot of the other things that we're doing, and we tried to make it better. We tried to make the money have more of an impact on the community, and wanted to put a little bit of thought behind what we were doing. So right now we've kind of graded the sidewalks in what we call a 3-tiered system. The first tier are the trip hazards, places where the slabs are uneven and obviously can create a tripping issue. When they're over 2 inches, that's when the city's got liability, according to our insurance carrier. And the city has liability if it's over that 2 inches, the city is aware of it and hasn't put a plan in place to take care of that deficiency. The second area of sidewalks are places where the slabs are broken or uneven, but not necessarily a trip hazard. And the third are gaps where we're missing sidewalk ramps, or just areas where there isn't sidewalk. There's areas in town where the sidewalks stop, there's grass for quite a ways, starts back up. So about 3 years ago, we started to focus on the trip hazards. And what we've been trying to do, as opposed to jumping around the city, we're trying to focus on, we started in one area and we're trying to sweep through a whole area of the city, and our plan is to just keep moving through that. And I've got a slide that'll show what we've done so far. We've also incorporated a relatively new technology, which is called concrete saw cutting. And I've got some pictures of that I'll show you. But basically, if that, in most cases where the heaved sidewalk is less than 2 inches or less than half the thickness of the slab, there can be a technique where it can be saw cut. It doesn't remove that sidewalk, but it takes that trip hazard out of play. And where we can do those, it costs about 25% of what it would cost to remove and replace the slab itself. So what we've been doing is hiring the contractor that does that. It's a proprietary system that they use. We give them a general area of the city. They go through, they remove all the trip hazards that they can do, like I said, at 25% of the cost of removing and replacing. And then the public works crews are going back and doing the removals and replacements of any of the trip hazards that are worse than that, or for some reason if the slabs are very thick or maybe not wide enough, then we've been completing those. We have not been contracting, except for the saw cutting, we have not been contracting out the remove and replacement. We've sent our guys to get trained. We've purchased some tools, not a lot of expense in that, and they've been getting better and better at it. So this is actually, it's a little bit light, but this is a copy of our Act 51 map. And if you see the big red circle on the top, that's the north side. So we didn't pick it for any reason other than that was a starting point. We went through the entire north side, and in a year and a half contracted to have all the saw cutting that could be done completed. There was probably 700-800 of those trip hazards that were removed. And then within about a year, maybe a little over a year and a half, our public works crews have been able to go through and remove all the balance of those. So as of right now, there's about 99% of the trip hazards that have been removed on the north side. When the saw cutting crew came through the last time, they finished the north side, and then the blue section that's in the center is the next section that they prepped with the concrete saw cutting. If you walk outside of City Hall, just on this block here, you can see where a lot of those sidewalks have been beveled and a lot of those issues are gone. And then we're planning to have that crew come back in to start working on the next section to the south of that, which would be basically west of Maple Street. The area up around Jefferson School, there's not a lot of sidewalks up there, so we'll pick up those as we move along, and then the plan would be to then move through the rest of the city, the same thing. Remove all the trip hazards by saw cutting, and then do the removal and replacements as we can. The areas that are in green are specific requests that we've had from council people that have relayed trip hazards for us. And so we've done several spot projects the last couple years where we've gone, and we don't just want to do one area. So when we go and find a major trip hazard or two, we'll do enough in that area or within a block or two that we can basically empty a truck. It's about 7.5 yards or about 100 slabs of replacement, so that we can keep the crew located in one area. They can jump back and forth and finish the concrete, and trying to be as efficient as possible. This is a picture of sidewalks on 5th Avenue. It's one of the first ones that we did. So you can see the lighter areas at each of the joints are areas where those sidewalks were beveled, and a lot of those trip hazards were removed. Past practice would have been to start at one corner, go to the other corner, remove them all and replace them all. And right now we're trying to stretch those dollars as far as we can. This is a picture of our crews on the north side in the middle of a pour. And this is a segment that was completed probably about a month ago. So funding has stayed the same. We pull about $10,000 out of the major street fund, $10,000 out of the local street fund, which gives us that $20,000 annually. So if we continue with this program the way we have and doing the methods that we have, I believe that we can get through the entire city and remove all the trip hazards within about a 6 to 8 year period. Oops. So I don't expect you to be able to read this or even see it, but this is a copy of the sidewalk zoning ordinance, or not the zoning ordinance, the sidewalk ordinance from the codified ordinances. And the section that I'll point out, because the city manager asked me to come up with some ideas on how we can enhance the program, how do we further it, how do we get more done, how do we speed it up. So the first step was for us to look at, well, what does the actual ordinance say? And I was not aware of this. But if you read the section in the red, it basically says that even though the sidewalks are owned by the city, the adjoining property owner is responsible for all the maintenance. Maintenance includes snow removal, includes replacing, repairing, fixing, and then it gives some provisions on if the adjacent property owner doesn't adhere to that, then the city gives a notification and the city can replace or complete those repairs and maintenance activities and bill the owner back. This has not been enforced for, well, I don't know, I couldn't tell you when the last time it was enforced under this. So this is not, the ordinance doesn't mirror the current program. So that brings us to a couple of discussion items. Does council want to enforce that ordinance where it requires the adjoining property owners to accept responsibility for it? Do we want to keep status quo? Do we want to make changes to that program by increasing the funding? There's a lot of different communities that try to do that in different ways. Some require a 50-50 contribution. City of Ludington has moved to a 50-50 contribution, but when there's a sale of a property, you're required to make sure that the sidewalks are brought up to current standards. We could simply, because the money that comes for repairing sidewalks comes out of our street funds, so we could shift some of the street fund money towards sidewalks to balance that out. So I just kind of wanted to go through kind of where we used to do it, what we're doing now, and then show you that there's a little discrepancy in how the ordinance reads and basically how we're operating it today.
I understand that how we would ask the sellers to bring their sidewalks up to code if they were transferring title to the property. We do that in the county. It was quite a big change in the county. You probably remember, Jeff, because you were involved more with countywide things back then. When they changed it so that when property transferred, wells and septic systems had to be inspected and graded. Right. And that cost was borne by the seller. It was very unpopular when it started, but it has really made an improvement, of course. But I just don't know how popular it's going to go over in the city to do that. And it doesn't really address the expediency of the problem sidewalks. It just is a haphazard kind of, well, if they're going to sell their property, then you'll look at the sidewalks.
I would equate this situation similar to the streets. I mean, we're making improvements in the streets, and we can quantify that, and the data shows it. And I think the only argument that the community might have is the pace at which we're able to move on it. And I think it's the same thing with the sidewalk. We're making strides in improving the sidewalks, but it's just not fast enough for everybody. So, you know, where do we want to go from there? Do we want to continue with the plan that the DPW's put in place and hit the high priority trip hazards and go through all that citywide, and then come back and take the next tier? You know, we'd like to know that, because it complicates it, and because we do get contacted by council, and that's your job. You know, you hear from people and they've got issues and you bring them to our attention. But then, you know, if that ramps up the pressure, and then we have to divert funds from what we planned on doing to do these spot repairs, that just throws the plan out of whack a little bit, and will even take longer. So we just need to know what's the priority for council.
Well, I'll throw this out. What kind of pricing could you bring a homeowner in the city? They wish to go ahead and repair their sidewalk because it was an ill repair. That was a common practice downstate where I'm from, so.
What do you think?
The city was the village, lived in a village, was able to contract with people, and I think actually the DPW did a lot of the sidewalk replacement. But they were able to get very competitive pricing, so that it made it a lot easier for the homeowners to go ahead and do that.
Well, I can answer that, I guess, two ways. One of the things that is happening now is, because we're doing the work in-house, the only out-of-pocket expense we have is the cost of the concrete. So every time we do that 100 slabs, 120 slabs, the only out-of-pocket we have is about $1,000, $900 to $1,000, and that's the cost of the concrete. Because the labor is already part of our workforce, it's already part of that effort. We've got the tools, we've got the equipment. If a contractor did it, they could probably, and had an efficient way of doing it, so they're doing more than just $1,000 at a time, you may be able to lower that unit cost down. But if you're talking about a sale of a home and there's 2-3 slabs that need to be replaced, I would think that price would go quite high.
Right.
So that my only concern with that, like when I heard how Ludington does it, my concern was you're probably paying twice what it would cost to fix that sidewalk than if you included it in a larger program where you've got the economies of scale, you know. And if we had to spot all around, then that you may spend $800 for 3 yards of concrete instead of $900 for 7 yards of concrete, because it's a short load.
Jeff, where that tree fell down at, in front of Avonmark, the sidewalk is pushed up because the roots came up and all that sort of stuff. When we identify a trip hazard and we say, okay, now we've got a liability, what's a reasonable time frame to deal with that with an ongoing liability?
There's a specific time frame per the state statute. I'd have to check what that is.
I mean, I would think once something created, we want to deal with it in as quick a manner as possible to eliminate that hazard, especially where people weren't used to it. I mean, there is an offset for that, and this is one of these things that it was pushed up and there was earth moved and all that, and it may simply be a matter of there was displaced soil underneath when it was raised up, and it needed to be leveled out, as opposed to let's break this up and replace it. I mean, it can be an expensive situation for 1 or 2 blocks of sidewalk, or there might be another solution.
Yeah, and it's almost impossible to be able to pull a slab up and reset it down.
You're gonna have voids,
Yeah.
it's gonna get hollow, and pressure, it's gonna crack.
Yeah, it'll change. And most of the trip hazards that occur are from trees. They're from tree roots. So when we're pulling those slabs out, we're using our stump grinder and our machinery to remove those. We've got direction on how to do that from members of the tree commission so that we don't harm the tree. But that's what's causing a lot of that heaving, and some of those have been there for decades.
So what you're saying is, according to the ordinance, if I decide to replace the sidewalks in front of my house, I have the option to do that?
What the ordinance says is it is your responsibility to upgrade and replace those.
Okay.
And if you don't, and we see that there's a heave section, a crack section, or you're not shoveling your snow, or, I mean, you could maybe even take it as far as if you're not edging it.
I'm gonna
and you
have
had
to
come in
agree.
and do it.
I would like to see enforcement of the ordinance for snow removal, because I go out and spend several hours clearing my sidewalk only to have the machine come down and blow it 3 inches deep right over the top of it again. And then I go out and repeat the process. And I understand they're not going to blow the snow out in the road, and they're not gonna blow it up on a private residence, but just blowing it forward and packing it down makes it much more of a labor for myself, and for other people that make the effort to keep their sidewalk clear. And then if I wanna walk downtown, I still have to walk in the street, because the people down from me don't bother to shovel their sidewalks, and you know, I hate seeing school children walking in the street, because there's packed ice, and it's actually more dangerous to walk on the unshoveled sidewalks than it is to walk in the street.
Well, there's two comments I'll make on that. One is, just like your snow blowers at home, you've got the skis that are on the side that ride along, and then you've got your cutting edge. On our equipment, we've set that cutting edge high enough so it's not catching those trip hazards and damaging the equipment, but that doesn't take the snow down to the sidewalk. So if you got a place where somebody doesn't shovel and the next person does shovel, it's gonna carry snow through that and probably leave that inch or so down. The other thing is, there's probably over 70 miles of sidewalks in the city, and there's just no way feasible that we can keep those plowed every time it snows during the winter. So when we go out with the sidewalk snow blowers, we're focusing on the school areas, the major streets first. If we get a stretch without a lot of new snow, then we can get further through the community. But once it snows again, it resets and you got to start over. So we've one of the machines that we bought 2 years ago, we bought a snow blower for that, and so we're getting more done, but we'll never be able to get everything cleaned at the same time in the city.
Well, it's not a city responsibility to clear sidewalks anyhow.
According to the current ordinance, it's not.
Mine is edging, because there's so many sidewalks in town that the sod is growing up around the sidewalk. Some areas, there's one on Concord that it's a foot wide, and it drives me crazy, but enforcement on that, I would love to see it, but and snow removal too. Leaves, grass, you don't leave that on the sidewalks. A lot of people will leave a clump of debris on the sidewalk, so you have to walk around it. It's a trip hazard. I have a question on one of the slides though, Jeff. The first slide you showed with the highlighted areas.
The map?
Yes. To be cut or saw cut, excuse me, fall of 2017. Looks like it ends right on 8th Street, but on the southeast corner, there are a few trip hazards
And that's just
between 9th and 8th, and that was my comment. Is that a generalization?
It's a generalization. What we've been doing is splitting the money in half, about $10,000 for saw cutting. That gets us about 400 to 550 trip hazards removed. So we'll start them off with a map, and we'll say, okay, here's where you ended last time. We only have $10,000. You can't go beyond that, and then they will move until those funds are done. Then we draw it on our map so we know where the start point is next time. Okay. Because if there's a half-inch trip hazard versus an inch and a half, those cost different, obviously. And the company's extremely good. They will pinpoint, they'll make a list of every one of them. They have GPS units, so we can track what they've done and where. They do a very good job of cleaning up. And then, so what that does is it allows $10,000 to purchase concrete. So our crews will go out when we've got the time, and we can usually do about 10 pours. And like I said, that's about 100 to 120 slabs each pour.
On that stretch I just outlined, there are several kids that ride their bike on the sidewalk. They're not riding on the streets, but it's probably up about that high.
Mm-hmm.
It'll take a tire out and flip the kid.
So if those exist, even though we stop at one point, we'll come back and get those in the next round. And that's our intention, is to just keep rolling through the city until we clean it all up.
Okay.
And then like Thad mentioned, then we'd go to tier 2. Then if we got broken sections or uneven sections that need to be repaired, take those on. And then if we get to it, then start filling in gaps where they're missing.
Are we still pouring sidewalks in the city?
We've
Because I know
done,
there are several streets that have none.
are we pouring new sidewalks? The only place that new sidewalks are planned, we poured new sidewalks on 12th Street along the major street during that project. The next segment that we're starting to program for is 12th Street and from Maple Street to 31. That'll have sidewalks on it. We have a grant to put sidewalks on one side of Cypress Street between 9th Street and 12th Street. That came from the Little Revenue Sharing Board. But generally, we're not doing new sidewalks, and for quite a few years haven't added sidewalks as part of the construction projects, the water and sewer projects either.
Because I know on the north side, there are some streets that don't have sidewalks.
Right. We've been, and correct me if I'm wrong, Denise, but we've been trying to encourage new developments to add sidewalk segments as they're being developed. And that creates some gaps, but over time, they'll fill in.
The self-storage place up on 12th
Right.
and Cypress, they will be doing that too, so.
Right.
Adding the sidewalk.
Right. So, and we've got an agreement with them, instead of them putting in the sidewalk and it not matching what the new road grade is, we've got an agreement so that they'll participate in the cost of that section of sidewalk when we do the project, the street project.
I would have to agree about making sure that the ordinance is enforced with the snow removal. But making residents pay, I think that won't go over very well. I mean, I would probably encourage, hey, if you want it done faster, you can pay for it yourself. But I wouldn't enforce it. That's my opinion.
We have noxious weeds. If people don't cut their weeds, we charge them for that, do we not?
We send out a notice, we give them 7 days to take care of the issue, and then if they do not, then we go out and we will cut it and then bill them according to the schedule.
Yeah.
So really, this ordinance, the way it's written, is pretty similar to that.
I was just thinking that and I would agree with Councilmember Pontiac. I'm not much in favor of charging residents to do the repair on the sidewalk, but residents that choose not to maintain the sidewalk for the safety of the community, it presents a different issue to me.
So I think we can bring back some proposed ordinance
Right.
revisions.
Yeah, we can bring back a plan. You know, it's gonna obviously educating the community on their responsibility now to clean their sidewalks. And instead of just being a suggestion, it's gonna be mandatory now. So we'll have to make sure we educate and communicate with the community, and then we're just gonna have to set up a process to identify those that aren't in compliance, and then some method to correct those.
Well, going back to public comment from the beginning of the work session, the question was raised, who's liable if somebody gets injured on the sidewalk? Is it the city or is it the homeowner?
Well, it's gonna depend if it's a trip hazard, as Jeff said, that we've been made aware of and meets the criteria of over 2 inches and we haven't corrected it and we've had time to correct it, then certainly we have a liability exposure. But if it's below the 2 inches, we don't know about things, we're not held responsible for those.
We hold people responsible that don't run water during notice during the winter season also. I mean, and that's an education process.
Right, yeah, and I'm just pointing out to council that we have to educate the community.
Okay.
Did that answer your question? or-
Probably not, because if it's less than 2 inches and somebody is, they
Well,
put
that's
their knee
based
out,
on.
who are they gonna,
Well, they're
who's liable
certainly,
for it?
they're certainly going to come after the city, and there's case law on point that says unless it's over 2 inches, that we're not liable for that.
So when those claims come in, we go out, snap photos, take a measurement of it, and answer those questions to our insurance carrier, and then they decide.
So is the homeowner then liable, is my question?
Homeowner has a liability as well as the city. I mean, it's in front of their
Well,
home. If they
you know,
haven't
and this is
removed the snow, then there's a hazard.
This is certainly a question for the city attorney, but I would think that the way the ordinance reads, that the homeowner's responsible for the condition and maintenance of the sidewalks, then they would have a liability exposure. That would be my guess.
So if it wasn't above the 2 inches and someone tripped and knocked their teeth out, so the homeowner would be reliable?
The way our ordinance is written, I think whoever was injured would have some good standing in court. But again, I'm not an attorney.
See that right
Maybe we need to work on that ordinance.
It's council's prerogative.
No, when we go around town and we're fixing the sidewalks, there's some sort of an assumption that the city takes care of the sidewalks. So there's gotta be a really good educational
Exactly.
program if you wanna change that perception and you wanna actually enforce this ordinance.
Right.
And that's right down to sidewalk cleaning. I mean, they clean sidewalks too, so they're assuming that,
Yeah.
So I think we need to like make it public what, what is expected and who's liable, and really get that. Cause if, like, the city will replace or, repair the sidewalk in certain ways, but then the residents like, well, I'll just wait until it gets that bad, but then something happens, there's like,
And that's not even in there.
who's liable kind of thing.
Well, we'll bring back something for council to consider at a future meeting, probably the second meeting in October.
That would be good.
I just can't tell.
Thank you.
No, that's
Thank
not,
you.
that's not third in.
On that, we will move on to discussion on council policy CP3, sale of city-owned property. City manager and Denise Blakeslee, planning and zoning director.
Good evening. The Planning Commission, part of the policy for the sale of city-owned property is the establishment of a base price. And we got the information from the city assessor, and that went before the Planning Commission at their September 7th meeting. And I'll run through what their discussion was. They had to establish a minimum pricing for the surplus city-owned properties, and that's in compliance with Council Policy 3. And the first property that they had looked at is, all of these properties are actually vacant. You've actually looked at the properties and approved the sale of them, but we did not establish that price. This property is over on, it's actually behind Quincy. There's an undeveloped street behind it. It is an unbuildable lot. The city assessor estimated that price at $2,000, and the Planning Commission agreed with that price. The next property is actually a landlocked property behind the residence on First Street, and that property, she established that value is $1,000. Again, it's an unbuildable lot. Probably the only person who would have any interest in that property would be the adjoining property owner. They actually have a retaining wall that is located on that property. Another one we have here is over on, I think, 2nd Street. I have a hard time seeing from here. Again, this is a non-conforming lot. It is actually, there's a topography issue with that because that ravine area and the hill that goes up. That property was established at $3,500. Then there is a property that is actually a buildable lot that is located on 9th Street. The assessor established that price as $18,000. And then there's a city-owned property. Again, this is very tricky. There's topography issues. There's no access from roads, anything. Molly estimated between 2,000 and 3,000. The Planning Commission actually set the price at the lower price at $2,000 for that property. And even though it doesn't have to go to the Planning Commission, while I was taking everything to the Planning Commission, there's that one property that's located in Filer Township, and she established that price as $3,800, and the Planning Commission agreed with that property price. And then there were 3 properties that the Planning Commission thought we would get more interest and better prices in having a broker to market, sell, and help establish those prices. There's the property on 6th Avenue with frontage on the Manistee River Channel. And there's the 2 buildable lots on Monroe Street. Those were created when we actually had that property was one parcel. Part of the property was located in Monroe Street. So that split actually allows street frontage to remain where it is, created 2 buildable lots. And then the final properties are industrial properties in Manistee Township in Lot 12 and 13 in the industrial park here. Again, the recommendation would be to actually go through and have a broker, realtor, help with marketing and the sale of those properties. I've actually drafted proposals for both, and I've actually drafted a bid packet for the other properties. They would actually go to every adjoining property owner would receive a copy of the bid packet. It would be noticed in the paper, and we put out an end date, and we'd see what we get back.
So what we intend to do is again, contact, on those landlocked properties, contact the adjoining property owners and see if they have any interest in purchasing that property at that price, and then they would submit sealed bids. On the other properties, we would put, as Denise said, put out a request for proposal, request for qualification, one for the residential lots, and then one for the commercial lots, and solicit brokers for those properties and have them assist us in determining an asking price and then marketing those properties for sale. So that's the intent we have moving forward. One of the things that we'll do in the near future is that policy is a little cumbersome, and I think it can be streamlined. So Denise and I are going to spend some time in creating a draft that we would like council to see and comment on, so we can streamline it a little bit, because part of the process is that there's almost a bidding war between council and prospective purchasers, and that gets to be kind of cumbersome. So we've got some ideas that we want to council look at a future date to modify that policy. But that's our intent in marketing the properties moving forward. They're all been determined excess property. We might as well get them on the tax rolls and get some money out of them, let other people enjoy that property.
I would like to make one suggestion, and that is with the lot for $18,000. If you could move that into the bid package to the.
Oh, into the.
Yeah, because it's a
packet.
buildable lot, and I
Okay.
think it'll be better marketed through a realtor or a broker.
If that's the wish of the council, we can just add it to that packet. That would be fine.
Is that the property on
Ninth.
8th?
Yeah, off of 8th, or off 9th and 8th.
Yeah, it's actually on 9th Street.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We can certainly put that in. We were just, that was our best guess. So we can do that. So we'll proceed forward. We'll draft letters to the adjacent properties, or the properties adjacent to that those landlocked properties, and then we'll publish our request for proposals, request for qualifications for brokers, and move forward.
Thank you.
Okay.
Item D, discussion on recycling center. Mr. McCullough, you're up again.
So there were still some questions that remained after we talked about this in August. So we went back and did a little bit more research on the recycling center. The biggest question that I recall was, how is it used? Is it for residents? Who's it used, or who's allowed to use it in the community? From the research I've been able to do, or been able to find, when the city created its own recycling site, it modeled it after the county's Public Act 69 program. And Public Act 69 allows or establishes a vehicle for counties to be able to tax residential properties to create recycling centers within individual townships and municipalities. Now the city created its site modeled after that, and again, that Public Act 69 restricts it to residential, but the city didn't pay for it the same way that the Public Act created. So that gives the city some flexibility. There's actually, I could find no written policy that says it's residential only, but that's how we've operated it, that's how we've signed it. We have not done any enforcement on non-residential people using that from the city. We just don't police it that closely. If we had somebody out there, if any one of you stood out there for a day, you would see that I'm sure that there's commercial customers that are using it. There's people from outside the city that are using it. The enforcement really, there hasn't really been any enforcement. Council's asked us to try to police it more often when we get violations, when we get people putting stuff outside the dumpsters. We've been looking at the cameras, and when we've found some people that have been violating that, then we'll talk to them. But there really hasn't been any enforcement action. Right now, the recycling center, or the entire refuse fund, is funded 59% through charge for service fees and 41% through the millage. So, and the funds that are used to support that recycling, all the tipping fees and such, come out of that refuse fund each year. Really, the area of concern for us is stuff that gets put outside of those dumpsters, things that shouldn't be there that get left there. I think there's a perception that has always been a problem, and that the problem continues. But from the Public Works perspective, when it was in the Public Works yard, we were cleaning that stuff up every day. And so when you would see there was a pile or something that was left over the weekend, certainly that was bothersome, but there was a lot more that was left that we were cleaning up on a daily basis. Now that it's over in the new site, and we've adjusted how many containers there are, and we've adjusted how often those get pulled, the problem for us is about 90% corrected. We check it regularly, maybe once or twice a week. We've got to go remove a few items out of there, haul them to the dumpster at the garage. But for us, that solution has been cured by the actions that we've taken. The cameras were installed as a deterrent, but it takes a lot of time to go back and review, because that thing gets used so much. And even though it captures images on a motion detector, there's just a ton of images. So when we find something, it takes hours and hours to try to go back and find out who that is. We've made the request that council suggested to switch the two cameras so that we put the higher resolution and we can get license plates on them. But that's what I had in my notes. I've got Matt Bioletti here from Republic that can give you perspective on what other communities are doing, so what some of the trends are. Are there any other questions that council had on this issue?
Has the camera been moved?
We've requested it from Top Line. It's in their schedule, but they haven't switched it yet.
Okay.
How many times do we empty, and what does it cost every time we get them emptied?
It's a great question, and probably a timely question. The commingled is what? I think the commingled is twice a week. And the fiber dumpsters, there's 6 of those fiber dumpsters, those get emptied 3 times a week. And so when we moved the site and we started having overflows, we changed the timing of when the commingled dumpster was removed and emptied. We added another fiber dumpster, and then we went to 3 times a week, and we've been catching up with that. So we rarely have the overflows anymore.
But what's the cost?
I don't have the cost in front of me. Do you remember what the commingled is? While he's looking up the commingled, the reason why it's an interesting and timely question is, as we were researching all this and going back through the last contract and the contract before it, in the 2010 contract with Republic, the contract with the city referenced the agreement that Republic had with the county PA 69 program. And so those costs were the same. And then they had an escalation per year. The fiber at that time, we weren't charged for because the commodity was valuable enough where Republic didn't have to charge. They were making enough off of that end product that they were offsetting their expenses. When the new contract got written, Republic doesn't serve the PA 69 Manistee County program, so they removed that reference from our contract, but it never got replaced with a new pricing scale. Today that commodity is worth less, so there's actually about a $200 per dumpster cost per month to do the fiber moving forward. And so we're working through what those numbers are, what that means. We're going to prepare an agenda item for you to consider and possibly some options, because that'll be a new expense to us that we didn't have figured into the current budget.
Have we seen it?
What is that? Per month? $381.75 each time that commingle gets dumped. And that's twice a week. That's 8 times a month.
You have 6 dumpsters over there, Jeff?
6 dumpsters.
$200,
12,000 a year.
14,400 per year. Have we seen an increase since Manistee Township has stopped their recycling program?
I haven't looked at the volumes. We haven't noticed any increase in the problems that we've had, because I've asked the staff specifically on that. I don't think we've looked at the trends on volumes yet. Matt said there hasn't been an increase in the volumes based on that, and it's hard because it changes seasonally too.
Yeah. With the commingle, I was at the recycle center Sunday, I believe, and people are throwing plastic bags and buckets and styrofoam. Does that cause any issues?
Want to answer that?
Sure. So the buckets are really considered bulky rigids. Bulky rigids don't typically go into a curbside program. They're dealt with differently. So each processing house has a designated list, and that's the materials that they accept. So when those items are outside of that list, it causes issues. The plastic bags are considered tangables. Plastic is still a recyclable commodity, but those bags, if they're just loose or they're packed with stuff, they have to be broken open, and it creates other issues. So, you know, it's something that most recycle centers are trying to get away from, is the plastic film bags.
How about the styrofoam? Because
Styrofoam is not accepted in our program, no.
There were several pieces of styrofoam in there.
And that leads to the 20% contamination rate that you're seeing across the United States. That's continuing to grow as people don't follow the rules per se, don't pay attention to the list.
There is a recycling company that located a large portion of their operation in Calva, or is in the process. And one of the things that they're looking at is the possibility of being able to offer the foam and some other of those items. And I've mentioned to you the resource recovery. There's 3 R's. What's the third? Regional Resource Recovery Team has been working with AES to look at end users of those materials and try to bring them here for economic development, so that it increases recycling, but it also makes an end product and has job creation here. And they're looking at some of those type of recycling that are not currently offered.
Any further questions or comments?
I have a stray question. I'm just curious, with videotaping of the recycling center, Has there been any wildlife in there that you've caught on film? Any deer or raccoons or anything like that in there?
I haven't seen anything when I've reviewed tape.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. I was curious about that.
I would be interested in knowing what curbside would cost for everybody if we did it for the city. And also if we took the money that we were using what we're using right now to dump and do all of the other stuff that we have to do, to supplement that.
Well, I think 2 years ago we came to city council and our staff's recommendation was actually to go to the curbside recycling, because right now it's $8, somewhere around $8 if you wanted to do it at your home, but it's a little bit higher because it's inefficient. And Republic explained that if we had a larger portion of the city, then when their trucks come up here, it's more efficient, drives down the price per household. And then some of the money that we're spending on the recycling program today, so all those tipping fees and stuff, either could go to help offset what that per household cost would be.
That's what I'm looking at, is trying to get some figures on that, and what you said about the more that sign up, or the more, if you made it mandatory, then everybody would be signed up, what would that cost be?
We can do that again, right?
Well,
Yeah.
just to be clear though, that when you say curbside, the dumpsters are the same size as the trash cans, not just those little containers, just so everybody knows.
Right, they're 94 gallon?
2006.
Yeah, there's,
So
No,
currently they're the 94 gallon totes, and they would get dumped every 2 weeks, and we can have Republic work on a cost profile for that.
cause when you hear container, you think those little green
It's not the little
things.
tubs
It's
anymore.
not, it's the actual trash can looking thing. So it's pretty big.
And Matt can speak to it, but I think that's where most communities are headed, aren't they?
But I think it would probably be beneficial to see if we did it citywide, and we offset the cost from the cost of operating the recycle center as it does now, what the impact would be.
Yeah, we can have those, we'll work those out and bring them back to council.
Okay, thank you.
Isn't the recycling center sitting on about half a lot?
Correct.
Yeah.
Roughly, yeah.
So that's another thing we could add back in. I mean, we could sell the entire lot then.
They still have like the soil and the brush and all that though, right?
Yeah, but there could be a different location for that. The reason why we chose that site is because that lot was previously acquired but never paid for by the adjoining landowner. They built the parking lot, decided they didn't need it, so we already had the pavement there. And so the investment by the city was to put up the fencing,
Okay.
purchase the cameras. The cameras could be reused. So the lost cost would be the fencing. Maybe that could be relocated to a different project. And then, we put an electrical service in there as well.
Now for the curbside, when people put the cardboard in with the other recycling, does that have issues with sorting? And because I know at the recycling center that's separate.
Right. So, yeah, go ahead.
So when you do curbside recycling, small cardboard, box board, cereal boxes, things like that go directly in your container. Larger packaging boxing, moving boxes, you just stack that flat alongside of it. They pick it up, it all comes out. The cardboard comes off on the pre-store initially when it goes through the recycle center. So that's one of the first items that they pull off is that large cardboard.
Today your commingled goes to one place.
Correct.
If you had it in the carts, it goes to a different source.
Correct.
Because I don't know if a lot of people know that. I mean, I didn't anyways. That would be something.
So because of the way we run, and you have to correct me, don't be sitting down. The way that we run the recycling center now, because we already kind of pre-sort the fiber out of it, then they sell it to a different location. But if that was mixed with the glass, plastic, and metals, then there's a separate hauler or site that would then separate that.
Yeah,
So it's a different location that processes it.
And I know that right now the people that do the curbside, they're basically paying for both, right? Because the millage and
Well, because the charge for service and the millage is already covering the current recycling site, they're paying the premium for having a cart at their house.
And
Correct.
most people, such as myself, it's a convenience factor.
Right, and that's for me too.
Any further question or comment?
So we'll bring back some more information for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Brings us to item E, discussion on water and sewer rates. Councilmember Linda Beaton requested that.
There's obviously been a lot of discussion amongst different members of the community about the cost going up to 25 million. And a lot of questions that I've gotten from citizens revolve around the fact that we had gone through this Burton and Associates rate study. And starting in 2014, we were supposed to be laying aside $200,000 for depreciation. It's what I've picked up in the capital improvement funds. People want to know what we've been using it for. I'm still really not 100% satisfied with having to approve a budget in May, which had the new capital improvement plans that showed $5 million for infiltration and $5 million for an equalization basin, which, by the way, the $5 million for the equalization basin was the only one that on its sheet had a footnote that said this could go up. So how do you, let's go through it again, because how from May 2nd do we get to estimating up to $5 million when the costs have been estimated all over the board over the last few years for both of those?
Well, as I've explained, is that we weren't certain what the cost was going to be. We just put a number in there, and that's why we put that qualifier on there that we weren't certain what it was going to cost, because we don't, at that time, we still don't have all the data we need to fully determine the size of that retention basin. And I'm trying to remember, maybe Jeff or Sean can help, when we actually got our permit, our new permit issued, and with all the conditions we had to meet. Do you remember when that was, Sean?
Wasn't that January 1st?
Yeah, so the permit, the NPDS permit, was negotiated at the end of last year, issued at the beginning of the year. But more importantly, the corrective action plan, which basically set the ground rules for dates and times when we had to complete items, was negotiated in January and February, and then they actually issued the formal letter to us on May 11th, where they outlined, here is what you will have to do to remove CSO 18 from a timeline standpoint.
So basically, we didn't have anything in
We got
writing.
it a week after we approved it,
Exactly.
basically.
Where we knew absolutely what was required of the city. And that's, and that was the quandary we were in. We'd had discussions with DEQ, but obviously you don't react until you get it in writing and when they commit to something. So, we had to put a number in there. And, it's just tough. We didn't have the information then. We don't have it now. We're still working on collecting the data to come up with the final solution.
Well, let me read you a couple sentences from the Barton and Associates rate study from 2014. It says, perform a revenue sufficiency analysis. Develop and populate a multi-year forecasting model for the city's water and sewer enterprise fund that will determine the level of annual revenue required to satisfy projected annual operating, debt service, including coverage, and capital cost requirements, as well as maintain adequate operating reserves. People that I've talked to who have been longtime residents really felt that this rate study was the end of it. In other words, they had to pay higher rates. They understood that. They don't seem to understand, and I don't particularly understand very well, how we can require anybody to pay more if this was supposed to be covered in our water and sewer rates. We're ready to serve to our usage. So where am I missing? What piece of information am I missing?
think we can address that. Why don't you let me go through their presentation? Since I'm running the video, right, I'm gonna sit here rather than go up to the podium too, just so I can make sure I get the right thing on. So just want to reiterate a few things. Councilmember Beaton mentioned the Burton and Associates rate study. That was done in April of 2014 and presented to council. A final report was issued in September of 2014. This rate study was a comprehensive review of our entire water and sewer utility. It was done based on American Water Works Association authorized and methodology. It's a guide for rate making. It's what's used all across the country. And in fact, the Burton study used the expanded approach because of the records that the city was able to maintain and keep rather than the shortened modified version. So it was a thorough and comprehensive study. There was 3 phases of that study. One was to perform a cost of service allocation. The second part was to develop a recommended rate structure. And the third part was to develop a multi-year financial plan. We modified our existing 2-part rate structure as a result of this rate study. And that's been in effect for fiscal years 15, 16, 17, and now fiscal year 18. This is from the Burton and Associates presentation that was given to council. The study objective really, and it's the objective of any rate study, is to allow your utility to become or move towards sustainability. And sustainability can be looked at in a couple of different ways. From a social standpoint, you want fair and equitable distribution of cost to our customers. That was one of the primary driving things of the rate study because we needed to be able to have Manistee Township, city customers, and Filer Township customers pay what's a fair and equitable rate because we knew we had these contracts that were coming up and we knew we had other challenges in the system. You have environmental sustainability in order to fund the cost of regulatory compliance. The retention basin and closing off CSO 18 is regulatory compliance cost. And then you have economic sustainability, so you can satisfy your operating costs, your asset management, service existing and new debt, meet your financial policies, and provide fiscal stability. So those were all kind of baked into this rate study, and that's what the graphic down on the right kind of shows.
Well, just for my clarification then, for 2013, we had put in our capital improvement plan, closure of CSO number 18 for $25,000.
So I'd let Jeff and the engineers talk about that, but that's the cost of actually building a bulkhead on CSO 18.
That's all it cost. That's all it would cost today.
Okay.
But if we close CSO 18, spend the $25,000, it would result in
the flooding of
in
100.
flooding.
Right.
So it's the flooding that we have to address. That's where all the money's at.
Okay, answer this then. I was also under the impression after reading this report that once we obtained the SAW grant, that part of that was going to be used to complete the study that was necessary for us to develop the cap.
And I want to make this very clear, that's absolutely correct. The SAW grant is not intended to help us solve our wet weather problem. It's intended to create an asset management program. But we have been and will continue to use the data that we've collected through the SAW grant to help us further study and diagnose and look at where the inflow and infiltration is getting into the system. So we're getting 2 bangs for that grant dollar.
Then, okay, then what do we need the $1 to $1.5 million for?
Because the SAW grant didn't televise and investigate the entire system. So part of that first bond offering would be to complete the study of the balance of that system. It would also complete modeling and other engineering activities. Do you have that in the presentation later? I know we've gone through it, but so it completes a lot of further study work, and it also completes the specific requirements that the state put in our corrective action program.
Is that because we ran out of time or ran out of money in the grant? Is that why we need the additional funds?
Well,
if the intention was to use the SAW grant for that?
No, we're using the SAW grant. We're leveraging the data from the SAW grant to help us find places where inflow and infiltration are come in. But that's not complete. That's a piece of it, but it's not complete.
But it was part of the SAW grant we used funds to pay for that televising that we got from the SAW grant, right?
The SAW grant paid to televise sewers,
Sure. And it's not completed yet.
but not all the sewers. How many, give me a percentage.
About 2/3 of the sewers.
About 2/3 of the sewers were televised as part of the SAW grant in order to create an asset management plan. We're using the video in a second mode to also look for sources of inflow and infiltration.
How much money do we have left on the SAW grant?
Pretty much wrapped up. I don't have the numbers right in front of us, but we're probably at least 75% of the way through, I would think, on our costs.
But we're done with the televising portion.
So the SAW grant had many, many different pieces to it, and one of the large pieces was televising, and so we've expended that allotment of funds. And so part of the next bond issue would be to supplement and finish the televising on the balance of it, along with all the other items in the cap.
Have we completely expended the SAW grant?
We've expended the SAW grant. We have not completed, we've completed 75% of that SAW grant, but the balance of the 25% is to complete the asset management plans, which is the purpose of the grant.
I can speak to that, Jeff, too. So no, we haven't. All the field work is done, and what's left in the SAW grant is basically to go through a process of looking at and prioritizing all the work in the city that needs to be done. Literally street by street, like we did the streets program. So we're going to do likelihood of failure on any given pipe. We're going to do what's called a consequence of failure. And so we look at the impacts of that pipe failing. So if it serves 2 people versus serving 1,000 people, it's got a lot more higher risk. And so we put those factors together, and we will literally lay out the city and prioritize that this is probably the most important pipe or pump station or part of the treatment plant. That's the first place we should spend our money. And so we'll have this long laundry list, and then based on those capital investments or the depreciation investments, we work our way down that list. What's really important, and I try and keep saying it because it's hard to think about it, but is the SAW is all about the structural condition of your system. It's how it is in terms of cracks and pipes. Will it fail? Will it break? It has nothing to do with water entering the system. Zero. They don't even mention that in it. Now it's a spin-off, and we utilize it, and quite frankly, we do the 2-for-1 on it because we're videotaping, and we can tell now what pipes are leaky. But the structural evaluation says this is rated a 4 or a 5. That's a bad rating. The reason it's rated that is because it's got a lot of cracks, or it's going to look like it could fail, not because it has water coming into it. So it's hard to dissect, to separate them, but that's what the SAW is about. It's about the structural condition of your system. And then it's a lot about inventorying. There's 50 some miles of pipe. We've inventoried every bit of it, the size, the inverts, the condition, every manhole. We scanned every manhole. So it's been going on for 2 years of data collection because your system is immense and there's a lot of work. But that part is done. And now we're moving on to taking all that data, organizing it, getting it so we can put it into GIS, we can graph it, we can map it, prioritize it, and then really come up with a capital improvement plan to address structural conditions. The cap from the DEQ, which we just got the direction on May 11th of this year, switches the whole thing over to totally focusing on I&I and infiltration and how you're going to address getting rid of CSO 18. And so that's about water coming in, storing it, eliminating it, and we're going to leverage on the SAW, but it's a different set of marching orders, complete different set of marching orders. So it's, and I'd be happy to sit down with anyone and explain it, because sometimes it just takes going through literally every task, and going through that long list I presented before of every item to show you what they're asking versus what the SAW's asked for, and probably 25% of the cap we stole right from the SAW. We said to the DEQ we're going to do these, and we were getting paid for the SAW to do them. But there's a lot of them we just couldn't do that. So that's what the remaining portion is. And we only did, I think we're at about 28 miles of televised sewer. Which means we have about 14 to 15 miles left in the system, something like that. And then we've scanned about 1,000 sanitary manholes, where we've got a picture of every manhole, condition assessed them, Every pump station we've tested, we've started through the treatment plant. We're working our way through the treatment plant to look at every facility and its condition. So it kind of went on there a little bit about that, but
It's okay.
I think there's a general sense in the community that I'm going to go back to another but related project. 2008, we identified the River Street sewer line at an estimated cost of $800,000 to rerun that line. We didn't do that until 2016, 2017. It cost us $1.75 million to do that. So the cost of delay can be substantial. Now, we paid $40,000 for Burton and Associates rate study. State of the art, you know, everybody's using it, great thing. It cleaned some things up, and then we made some adjustments to it. But the premise of this rate study was we're gonna start building a fund through these 8.5, 8.5, 3.5, and so on rate increases over a period of time to fund depreciation in the system. And I'm assuming, since we're gonna fund depreciation, we're going to have a plan on what we're going to fix at what point in time with these revenues coming in. Now we're gonna take that money and pay the cap debt bond service instead of fund depreciation. So what's the cost down the line, because we're no longer going to have that available to fund depreciation items? And I think, you know, that's where some people are coming from. They're saying, we're gonna rob Peter to pay Paul. When are we going to get back to paying Peter? And how much more is it gonna cost us later on because we did that?
I think we will address a number of those points in the rest of the presentation, so hopefully that'll clear up some of that, and then if there's additional questions, we can answer those. So this was the basis of the Burton rate study, primary concerns of it. There's been some questions posed about what the new rate structure was compared to what the old rate structure was. The old rate structure was also a two-part system. It had volume charges, and it had what was called bond debt, and that was simply a product of how it was termed in the ordinance back in the 90s when it was implemented. But that was a fixed monthly charge. It was never increased because it was specified to be $6.60 per month, and that was what was in the ordinance. But that was a de facto ready-to-serve charge. It just wasn't called that. And so when we did the Burton and Associates rate study, we looked at all the factors and we adjusted the ready-to-serve charge, which I'll show you on the next slide. But I want to clear that up. We've always had, in effect, a ready-to-serve charge. It's just been at a lower rate, and it was charged only on the sewer. It just wasn't really called. This two-part rate structure that uses volume and ready-to-serve is a standard in the utility industry, and it's designed to balance financial stability with affordability for our customers. Utilities have substantial investments in their capacity-related costs and other fixed costs that are incurred year-round to maintain a state of readiness to meet peak demand. So that, hence, is why they call it a ready-to-serve charge, because we have a lot of people that go away in the winter and don't use any water. But when they get back and turn up their sprinkler system and crank their tap up, the system's got to be there to support that. And that's why you have to have a certain amount of your cost in the system that are based on a fixed monthly basis. So it meets those peak demands, helps to fund that, but also makes sure that the system is available. And one of the compromises that was made in this study is Burton & Associates actually recommended, because it's an industry standard, that the ready-to-serve charge be twice of what we currently set it at. But we didn't feel that the community or council would be supportive of that, so we backed that off to 50% of what's recommended at the industry. It was still an increase above that $6.60, but it's only half of what is recommended by rate consultants. Okay, this slide is out of the Burton rate study, and it's from 2001 through projected 2017. The two lines that you see on here, one is the Water and Sewer Consumers Price Index, which is calculated by the federal government. You can see from 2001 to 2017, it's up about 140% on a cumulative basis. The lower line is what the city water and sewer rates have done. So our water and sewer rates, even though we've had increases, regular increases on inflation or increases beyond that based on projects that were needing to be done, trails the CPI industry. We've been consistently lower. The recommendations in this rate study would fund our needed improvements with rate adjustments that are lower than the industry. So that's a good thing for our customers because they're not paying what other communities or other costs typically go up. And that's because of the system, the way it's managed. We don't have a water treatment plant, which is expensive to run. We have well waters, but on the flip side of that, we have an old sewer system. So I just think it's important to point that out. That was something that Burton thought was very important for the community to know as well. Our current water and sewer rates for a typical 5/8 and or 3/4 inch residential meter, water is $2.93 per 1,000 gallons, and sewer is $8.03 per 1,000 gallons. Our water ready-to-serve charge is $4.15 per month, and our sewer ready-to-serve charge is $11.94 per month. So our fixed monthly charge went from $6.60 to roughly $16 per month, so a little more than double. A typical 6,000 gallon per month customer would pay $65.77 in volume cost and $16 and change in ready-to-serve costs for about $82 overall. 80% of those charges are based on volume and 20% are based on ready-to-serve. So if you have a very low volume user, they experienced a greater percentage increase in their typical bill than somebody who's using more water, which is expected because some of the charges were switched over to that ready-to-serve. A greater proportion of the system revenues are being generated by that fixed monthly charge. And that's what helps to lend stability to the system. If those lower volume users were snowbirds, they wouldn't be using any volume. And so that's one of the things that the industry has been moving to. Let's talk a little bit about depreciation. Depreciation is simply an accounting method or an estimate that allocates the cost of a tangible asset over a period of time. It is not necessarily the potential economic life of the asset. And let me give you an example. There's auto manufacturing stamping plants that have 50-year-old stamps that they're still using in presses that are long ago depreciated. So the point is, it's a proxy for your system assets and how the value of those is spread out over time. It's also not a measure of the amount of work that needs to be done each other, but again, it's a proxy for that. Depreciation is a non-cash expense on our audited financial statements, so it doesn't show up on normally the quarterly reports that I show you. We only really invoke that as part of the audited statements because that's what the generally accepted accounting principles require. And again, it's a proxy only for needed repairs, replacement, and renewal of assets.
Mr. Bradford,
Yes, sir.
on numerous occasions, we replace equipment at the Public Works based on the end of its useful life.
Yes, we do.
And we do maintenance on systems because they've reached the end of their useful life. I guess the question people are asking me is, do we plan these repairs? Do we have a schedule or do we have events we're looking at in the water and sewer system along the same line? And I understand what you're saying about depreciation. It's, you know, it's a number you throw in there and it's representative of movement over time, okay?
Yeah, the
It's
answer
not
to
a
your-
specific product.
The answer to your question is absolutely yes, and I can demonstrate that here in a minute. We'll go over that. Actually, the city has been quite proactive in that, and that goes all the way back to Ed Cody's time. And Ed was instrumental in looking out 4 to 5 to 6 years to try to see what kind of preventive stuff and repairs and replacements and upgrades that he wanted to do, primarily because he wanted to leave the utility in as good as possible condition as he could, given the funding limitations for the next guy that came on. So, I mean, Jeff can speak to that. He's the one who really started that process, and we'll see some of that in a little bit. So our utilities need to generate revenue sufficient to do several things. One is to operate the system, pay our operating costs, salaries, wages, electricity, chemicals, that sort of thing. Have to service our debt. We have to do repairs and maintenance, and occasionally we have to do replacement of assets. And our rate should be set to cover those costs. And they have been set to cover those costs. And I want to make that clear, and we'll demonstrate that in a minute. The rate study that Burton did has set the city up to meet these needs over time. Doesn't happen immediately, but over time, this rate study has put us on that path. I wanted to demonstrate to you what the investment in our system has been over the past, since 2011. And these numbers come from the amount of assets that I capitalize and put on our books as part of our annual audit. So over that 7-year period, we've capitalized or put on the books about $9.4 million. That can be repairs and replacements. It can be new things. It included the sewer separation projects, which put in all new pipes in the ground. There's an enormous amount of stuff. It includes the Maywood Tower. You'll see a list of some of the things we've done. Our depreciation over that same time period has only been $7.7 million. Now, that's not to say this was all funded in cash from the system, because it hasn't been. Some of this has been funded in debt. Most of this has been funded with debt. But our rates are sufficient to cover that debt service. Are we paying some interest for financing costs? Absolutely. Yep, we are, because we don't have those cash reserves to do this magnitude of project. But what this demonstrates is that since 2011, we have been over investing in the system based on what the depreciation would indicate. But I want to be clear, depreciation is just a proxy. It's just a measurement. These are some of the projects that we've done, and it's not all of them. The list would be 3 times this long if we put everything up there, but just to give you an idea. And I've kind of tagged these as either repair and replacement or new, because we do both. So for instance, the Edgewater water main that we had to put in for the development over here, that was new. That main wasn't there before. River and Oak valves that we shut down River Street for recently, though, that's repair and replacement. We've done SCADA upgrades. We've replaced sewer mains. We've done the 6th Avenue pump station and sewer. And I do want to make one comment, Mary. You had said that the original cost for that was estimated to be $800,000 and that the final cost was 1.7. If I'm not mistaken, I'd have to double check. That 1.7 also included the new guts of the 6th Avenue pump station, not just the riverbank sewer replacement itself. So those aren't quite an apple to apples comparisons, but you are absolutely correct that prices do go up over time. No question about it.
And the new
force main under the river. We did a roaming collector to help to get our reads easier and save staff time, significant amounts of staff time. So some of these are investments in efficiency. We've rebuilt a number of pump stations. We've added generators, and we've done 2 very significant separation projects, the Cedar Street and the Jones Street. Sean helped to put these together, but I'm going to run through them. So the SAW grant and asset management is doing exactly what I think I've heard every member of council want us to do, is to prioritize these fixes, make sure we're taking care and maintaining what we've got. The SAW grant is going to give us an asset management system, at least on the wastewater side, for our wastewater assets. And using asset management is a much better method than just using depreciation as a measure of the needed investment. We all agree on that. That's what we do with our street asset management plan, is we look at that and we evaluate and we have tools. The SAW is going to give us those exact same tools for the wastewater side. And as Sean mentioned, they've done an asset inventory, miles and miles of sewer, thousands of manholes, pump stations. They've completing the condition assessment by scanning, photographing, inventorying, televising, testing pumps. This is all part of establishing this asset management plan. If we continue on, they're going to be doing risk assessment of the system based on, as Sean mentioned, the likelihood of failure. Kind of similar to a PACER rating, right? I mean, a PACER rating of 1 or a PACER rating of 7, they'll have some kind of a scale to do that. Sean can speak more to that. He talked about consequences of failure. You know, if our main interceptor collapses right near the plant, that's a huge impact. If it's just a little main that serves a small part of the city or a little neighborhood, it's not as significant a failure. It's significant to those customers, obviously, but maybe not to the whole overall city. They're going to look at the criticality or risk, and then they're going to identify capital improvement projects and rank those based upon their criticality. And also looking at the most cost-effective treatments, exactly like we do with our streets. Is it better to do a mill and fill? Is it better to do a slurry seal? Is it better to reconstruct? That's what this SAW grant is gonna give us for our wastewater system. Talking a little bit about closing CSO 18, Sean mentioned this the last time we presented this, kind of looking at 3 phases potentially for this, depending on what USDA decides they would like us to do. But we talked about the first phase being a market bond, revenue bond to fund the additional investigation work that needs to happen. This is some of the work that Sean has indicated what would be covered by that bond. So that's roughly 1.5 million. And then rural development, because of their fiscal year, has suggested, and Sean has had the most direct conversations on that we break our application to them into 2 phases. One would be mitigation within the collection system. And let's be clear on that. Mitigation within the collection system is repair, renewal, and maintenance of our system. It's lining those broken pipes. That would be something that is akin to resurfacing a street. So that money isn't just funding investigation or a new asset in the retention treatment basement. It's also going to be funding repairs and maintenance to the system, which is what we want to be doing. And then this is, assuming the whole thing was 25 million, up to 18.5 million for phase 3 storage. I want to be clear on something here, though. I mean, we've been led to believe by rural development that we're likely to get a grant if we apply, or not a grant, a loan if we apply for it. And if we meet certain criteria, probably on the phase 3, there's the possibility of some grant money. But we don't know what that grant money would be or if it will be, and we're not counting on that. But that's certainly possible. But we really need to get these applications into rural development so that they can process them and we can have some more assurances.
If I can step in, Councilwoman Beaton asked the question about why the capital improvement plan had the 5 million before. And at that time, rural development was telling us that there was a very high likelihood that we would be funded, certainly through low interest loans, but certainly there was a great possibility of us getting grant money for that too, as long as it was available. Since that time, we've had an election, the president's changed. He's actually discussed reducing funding to the Rural Development Fund overall. So lots of communities are all trying to get at that money right now. So because that likelihood may have decreased, and we don't know, when we went to the notice of intent to issue the bonds, we had to maximize that because we just don't know, like Thad said, what that overall project's going to end up costing. But then we're not 100% sure what the financing package is going to be at this time either.
Do the events down in Texas and Florida have any impact on the amount of federal dollars that would be given out to the states to disperse to any of these programs?
I'm not that familiar with it, but just what I know in the proposed budget that the president put out, that he wanted to eliminate CDBG grant funding and reduce significantly USDA funding. Those 2 events would give him a reason to do that, because then they could redirect dollars to those. So there's just a lot of unknowns right now. Probably the biggest unknown, we've talked about it, is whether we're going to be eligible for a grant. And the grant could be substantial, but it's based on different criteria, and we won't know until they fully evaluate our application.
So if I might continue on, if you look at the cost here, so you've got 1.5, if you assume 5, that's 6.5, and then worst case scenario, 18.5, hopefully that gets you up to the 25. That would be to the maximum of what the notice intent was issued for. The way this financing would lay out for this would be phase 1, we would do a revenue bond, assuming it's about $1.5 million. That would be an open market issue based on current rates, approximately $82,000 in annual debt service. If you assume the next $5 million went towards lining and doing some other remediation things, and that was a USDA loan, currently the interest rate's 2%, that would add about $183,000 in annual debt service. And then the last phase, if you assumed, I put 13.5 million, which makes this a $20 million project, which we don't think is an unreasonable amount. that would give you about $495,000 a year in annual debt service. So if you add all of those up, that's about 5, 670, 850 roughly. That seems like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money a year. But what I want to point out is, and I heard Councilmember Beaton mention this, is people are very concerned about the rates having to be jacked way up to fund this. And I've tried to demonstrate, and we'll try to demonstrate it again tonight, that that probably isn't going to be the case. And I'll show you why that's going to be the case. We should be able to fund this more or less within the rate increases that have been laid out in the rate study. If things, if all the assumptions that we're making happen, which I think are likely. So the reason that can work is because our debt service right now is about $1.43 million annually through fiscal year 2020. Then that declines to $750,000 in 2021, a reduction of $683,000, and $600,000 in 2022, a reduction of $136,000. So right there you have $820,000. That is just about enough to cover all of the new debt that I just laid out on this previous slide. So with that said, there may need to be some gap financing, internal loans, some creative structuring of the debt in that over the next couple of years, maybe 2018, 2019, 2020, whatever, to make that all work. But depending on the timing of the loans, how they're closed, how they're structured, that's manageable. But that should not result, absent some other changes, in having to substantially raise the rates beyond the 3.5% that we've already figured into the budget, unless there's some other regulatory thing that comes along. And as I said, it might require some internal gap financing in fiscal year 2019 and 2020. Now, the mayor has pointed out that then reduces the amount of money that's available to do things like slip lining pipes, rebuilding pump stations, and that sort of stuff. But it really depends on the amount of debt that we have to take once we get the prices from Sean, and what the financing is. It's possible that there's still a significant amount of dollars that are being generated because of this rate study and the stuff that we've set in place to still fund some of those items. And some of this remediation project is going to be funding some of those items, slip lining and that sort of thing. That's a big issue on the sewer system. Besides taking care of your wastewater treatment plant and your pump stations, that's what's left. You fix the main so they don't collapse and they don't leak and they don't get clogged up. And so this shows like $5 million worth of work to do that, to help get the water out and shore up some of those mains. This chart here shows when that debt drops off, and it doesn't include any of the new debt, but you can see it drops off over time. Plus we're going to have our regular inflationary rate increases, the 3.5% that was laid out in the study, which will help to generate more revenue. Plus, we've done a whole lot of projects. We've rebuilt a lot of the pump stations. We've repainted both of the tanks. A whole lot of this maintenance on the system has been done. And that's not to say that there won't need to be more stuff done, but if you go back a few years and look at some of the capital improvement plans, you can see Ed Cody had laid out a whole bunch of different things, and we've been systematically dealing with those and addressing them. And there's still more to do, just like there's still more streets to do, but we've addressed a lot of that. So I think there's some confusion that this potential large bond issue is going to result in some huge, for many people, catastrophic rate increase, and that simply isn't likely to happen based on the numbers that we have today. Now, let me give you a scenario that could change that. If we can't get rural development funding at 2% over 40 years, and we have to go to the open market and fund it over 20 years at a higher interest rate, that's going to make a difference. Mm-hmm. We're very confident we're going to get some rural development funding. That's been the conversation all along. They know this is coming. But until we actually have the paperwork, we don't know that for sure. But that's how we're progressing with this. So I think hopefully that can address some of the questions and concerns. The rate study is set up to put the utility on a sustainable financial path, and I think it's done a very good job of that. And we'll continue to do a good job of that if we continue to follow, its principles and manage the system well. And I don't think that we're handicapping ourselves a tremendous amount in being able to maintain the system going forward, because we've already done a lot of work. We won't be able to do as much as we would if we didn't have to incur all this debt, but maybe the project comes in at $10 million instead of $25 million or $20 million. Then the amount of this debt service that drops off, that's going to be needed for the new debt will be quite a bit less, and we'll have more money on an annual basis to address other things. So a lot of it's gonna depend on where those final numbers come in, which is why it's so important to identify the really low-hanging fruit, if there is any, and if not, the next level up through this study, so we can get that water out of the system, so we can reduce the size of the retention basin and bring down the cost. And that's what we're trying to do. I don't know if anybody, if you guys want to add anything?
I think you hit it all.
I appreciate the work that you've done in a short amount of time to put this together. I like these slides. Can we put them on our website?
Sure.
It would just be so much easier for me to say, take a look at the meeting, the video, and take a look at what's on the website.
We can get those out there,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Comments? Anything else anyone wants to bring up on council?
I just have one question for two people. For Jeff and Steve, the painting of the crosswalks at Kennedy School, have we got any feedback? You know, is it making any difference?
Well, I'll let Steve answer the question, but we've got the painting done. We intend to do a couple places on Spruce Street as well, do the same technique where 6th Street connects Jefferson School and Kennedy. The signs have been back ordered. I think everybody ordered school signs at the same time, but we've got most of them up, and we'll supplement when they're complete.
The painting itself has brought some good attention, and we've been hearing some feedback on that. I've been kind of monitoring a little bit in the morning, and the people are starting to slow down in there. I've been in contact with the principal about the parking situation on 6th Street, and we're going to meet here sometime next week. But things seem to be going pretty smoothly there.
Okay, well worth it then. Good, thank you.
No one else?
Just one more note. I mentioned this to Thad yesterday as I was coming out of a meeting with him on something else. And that is, we're talking about the capital improvement plans and how they're laid out in the binders that we get in our booklets. It would be, I hate to add to your burden, Ed, but it'd be nice to see a comparison each year as to what's coming off that we've completed in cash. Every year you go through there and that you don't have a history that leads you back to,
Well,
hey, this
maybe,
was on the prior years and we were able to accomplish this.
Projects completed. I think
Kind
we
of,
could, I
yeah.
think we could add something like that.
Yeah, I think it would be handy because going back through these just over the last, couple of weeks has been a little bit labor intensive, and it would be easier to see. So I could tell that there were quite a few projects that were completed. So, but it's just not evident, when you pick up, here's this year's set of numbers.
Primarily, the water and sewer has the bulk of those projects, and we could certainly go back and, based on what we've capitalized and put on the books on any given year, we could list that out pretty quickly and add that just as an appendix or something.
Okay. Thank you.
I'd like to thank each member of the staff that made their presentations and added to the discussion tonight. I think it was thoughtfully done and well prepared. I appreciate the information. Gives us a lot to share with people that have concerns and questions. Thanks to the members of the public that are here, however sparse. It's good to have you. With that, I take a motion to adjourn.